Hi, I'm Brian, and welcome to my channel. We're here for our first Muddy Boots hike at Valley Forge National Historic Park. Valley Forge is the site of the winter encampment of the Continental Army under George Washington during the winter of 1777 into 1778, during the third winter of the American Revolutionary War. Valley Forge is a place of hardship and endurance, a place of pain and pride. The American Army suffered here, losing perhaps as many as 2,000 men, and yet came out a stronger and more unified force in spite of it. It's a place where training and know-how began to supplant amateur ignorance. It's a place where all the parables we'll ever want to find about the American and human values of courage, endurance, inventiveness, sacrifice, and unity can be found. It is a place where legends exist, side by side with history. The very first stop on our tour actually isn't much of a stop. The visitor centers are closed. It's now February of 2021, and the visitor centers are all closed for two reasons. One is the main visitor center is being refurbished, and the other reason is because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're starting off in this direction. Visitor center should be tour stop number 1. There's not much to see right now, except there is a very useful information kiosk that gives you a very good overview on the importance of the Valley Forge encampment. And we'll see what they're about in just a minute. Now it's February of 2021, and the temporary visitor center has been in operation for about 2 years, while the main visitor center gets refurbished. But unfortunately now the temporary visitor center is also closed because of COVID-19. All the major buildings in the national park system are now closed, including Valley Forge. The visitor center still has a few useful tidbits for you. There is somebody inside there manning the information window, and you can get your trail maps and your park brochures and other pieces of useful literature from the temporary visitor center. I hope you'll forgive the sunglasses because without them I'd be going snowblind really quickly. The Revolutionary War had been going on for over 2 years, and George Washington's army had had a bad year in 1777. The British had attacked the Patriot capital of Philadelphia in the fall. Washington had been defeated in several battles trying to defend it. Philadelphia fell to the British in October of 1777. The Continental Congress evacuated to safer quarters in York, Pennsylvania. And yet, the spirit of the Continental Army was not broken by a long shot. At the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, the Americans had fought harder and better than they ever had before, giving the British such ferocious fights that the victorious British were in no mood to tangle with the feisty Americans any further, and on both occasions allowed them to retreat without any pursuit. The defeats that the Americans had been handed in the last 4 months were disappointments, not disasters. Other things were happening elsewhere. In upstate New York, a second British army had been completely destroyed by a second American army under Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. Despite the loss of the capital, the turning point of the war had already happened at the Battle of Saratoga. European nations were beginning to seriously consider recognizing the independence of the new United States. And so, on December the 19th, 1777, the Continental Army marched into Valley Forge with a mixture of frustration and optimism. The war was going hard for them, it was true, but it was also hard for their British opponents. The Americans were not at their lowest point in the war, and they were not close to disintegration. The winter of 1777 into 78 would come and go, and the spring of 1778 would have other chances to continue this fight for freedom. They just had to endure this winter first. The notion of a continental army on the verge of collapse is one of the enduring legends of this place. Valley Forge is a place where history collides with legend. The legends also give us stories of howling snowstorms and soldiers shivering in bone-numbing cold. The legends tell of an untrained and undisciplined mob of a force being miraculously, almost overnight, transformed in a few months by a benevolent German baron who would become an American hero. The legends and the lore of Valley Forge have lasted for almost 250 years, and for very good reasons. The legends and the lore make for great stories. We're here at Valley Forge today because the history makes for better stories. Here at the temporary visitor center, you can still get a pretty good overview of what the park is and what our hike has in store just by looking at the great big map that they have here, that they've helpfully have here for us. I'm going to turn you around so you can see. This large park map is one of the things that the limited use visitor center does have for us. And let's get a good overview of where we are and what we're going to see. We are right here at the visitor center. We're actually right here at this parking lot. See, that's the parking lot. We've seen pretty much everything there is to see at tour stop number 1. Next we hit the trail and we check out stops 2, 3, and 4, the outer line defenses. And then it's up to George Washington's headquarters, and then we check out the inner line defenses. When the Americans moved into Valley Forge and set things up, we'll elaborate more on this later on, but they quickly discovered that Valley Forge was a sort of a natural triangle, and that was great for protecting the camp. The Schuylkill River forms one side of the triangle to the north, and it would be very hard for the British to launch an amphibious attack into the camp from the north bank. So that was pretty safe. The British probably weren't going to attack from the west either, because we have two mountains here, Mount Misery and Mount Joy. And in order to attack from the west, the British would have to march up one mountain, down that mountain, into a creek, and then up another mountain and down it before getting into the camp again. Again, that would be something that's very hard for the British to do. And that left the southeastern approaches here, which the Americans quickly turned into a gigantic kill zone. American entrenchments and fortifications were all up and down this area, and hence we call it the outer line drive. And if the British tried to attack from the south or southeast, they wouldn't run into any natural obstacles, but they'd run into a lot of cannons and muskets of the Americans, who would basically turn any such attack into a fiasco. At least that was the hope. We'll never know what would have happened, because the British took one look at Valley Forge and they decided they were never going to attack the Americans this winter in this encampment. So the Americans faced many challenges during the winter encampment, but a full-scale British attack was not one of them. And we'll elaborate more on that later. All right, with both the visitor centers closed down, we're coming up on our information kiosk. With both of the visitor centers closed down, the information kiosk here is really the reason for tour stop number 1. It does give us a nice illustration and a nice overview of the entire encampment. Now, one of the most important things about the kiosk here is this illustration, because it gives us a peek at what the campsite must have looked like during that winter. National Historic Parks typically preserve the land and restore the land to what it looked like during its time of historical relevance. Valley Forge doesn't do this, for reasons evident in this painting. Valley Forge is, as we will soon see, a beautiful large green park with lots of grassland and pleasant patches of woods that are nice and shady in the summer. It's a far cry from what Valley Forge looked like when a half-starved, raggedy army set up camp here. Every single tree for miles around died a quick death for the purposes of supplying timber for the cabins. Even more wood went up in flames all day, every day, as fires burned to warm all the cabins and as cooking fires were lit several times a day to cook the meals. By the end of the Valley Forge encampment, the neighborhood had no more healthy trees around it than the surface of the moon did. There were no trees, and soon there was no grass either, as the feet of 12,000 men and the hooves of uncounted thousands of animals churned up the entire campsite into a gigantic, ugly plateau of mud. So from now on, any place we go to at Valley Forge will have to keep this image in mind: treeless, muddy, and bustling with dirty workaday activity. And the kiosk does read for us. Valley Forge is the location of the 1777-1778 winter encampment of the Continental Army under General George Washington. The Continental Army, which was actually a collection of disparate colonial militias, emerged under Washington's leadership as a cohesive and disciplined fighting force. In late 1777, while the British occupied the Patriot capital of Philadelphia, Washington decided to have his troops winter at Valley Forge, a day's march from Philadelphia. Valley Forge was a naturally defensible plateau where they could train and recoup from the year's battles, while winter weather, impassable roads, and scant supplies stopped the fighting. On December 19, 1777, 12,000 soldiers and 400 women and children marched into Valley Forge and began to build what would become the fourth largest city in the United States, with 1,500 log huts and 2 miles of fortifications. Lasting 6 months, from December until June, the encampment was as diverse as any city, with people who were free and enslaved, wealthy and impoverished, speakers of several languages, and adherents of several religions. Concentrating the soldiers in one vast camp allowed the army to protect the countryside and be better able to resist a British attack. But it became costly when the lack of supplies and hunger affected the inhabitants, and diseases like influenza and typhoid spread through the camp. While there was never a battle at Valley Forge, disease killed nearly 2,000 people during the encampment. During the encampment, Washington inspired the soldiers through his own resilience and sense of duty. He persuaded Congress to reform the supply system and to end the crippling shortages, and attracted experienced officers to the cause, including former Prussian officer Baron von Steuben, who was assigned the task of training the troops. Von Steuben taught the soldiers new military skills and to fight as a unified army. These reforms in supply systems and fighting tactics, along with reforms in military hygiene and army organizations, became the foundation of the modern United States Army. In May, word came to General Washington that the long-sought alliance with France was secured. The British soon evacuated Philadelphia and headed north to defend their stronghold in New York City. And on June 19, 1778, Washington troops marched out of Valley Forge in pursuit. The Continental Army's transformative experience at Valley Forge reshaped it into a unified force capable of defeating the British and winning American independence during the remaining 5 years of the war. When the army marched out of Valley Forge, they left behind a treeless, fouled landscape, unfit for farming. Slowly, farmers reclaimed their land by plowing down earthworks, demolishing huts for timber, and rebuilding fences and buildings, and replanting trees. When General Washington visited Valley Forge 10 years later, he was pleased to see the land recovering from the burden of occupation. During the next century, as Valley Forge prospered with the rest of the nation, the thought of preservation slowly faded. Subsequent generations of Americans developed myths about the encampment, many repeated so frequently that some accept them as fact today. Concerned about local development, citizens led a public campaign to preserve Valley Forge as a national park. On July 4, 1976, President Gerald R. Ford established Valley Forge National Historic Park, a unit of the National Park System. Each generation finds meaning in Valley Forge, a place that provides a tangible link to one of the most defining events in our nation's history. The National Park Service and its partners continue to rely on citizen participation and advocacy to preserve Valley Forge for the enjoyment of current and future generations. Now, just a short distance from this kiosk, we can walk over here a little bit and we can take a peek about what I meant about what is supposed to be the real Valley Forge Visitor Center. Like I said, at the time of filming this, this is February of 2021, and this visitor center has been closed up for some time. It's undergoing a massive refurbishment project, and that was before the pandemic hit. It has always been one of the largest and most impressive museums and information centers dedicated to the American Revolution, and it's going to be again. I have absolute faith in. But it can't be part of our tour today. And here we're coming up on our first brigade marker, and it nails down the spot of Peter Muhlenberg's brigade. It's one of 15 such markers. Washington's army was grouped into 5 divisions, with 15 brigades of various sizes comprising them. As we can see, brigades were made up of several regiments. In this case, 6 of them. All of Muellenberg's soldiers came from Virginia, except for that top regiment full of Pennsylvanians. Brigade markers are important here at Valley Forge because every time we see one, we need to, in our mind's eye, imagine 60, 70, or 80 huts behind it. Any given hut would hold 12 soldiers, or a smaller number of officers, with each regiment numbering between 200 or 300 soldiers, each brigade numbering between 800 and 1200. The number of huts in each brigade needed could really vary. And behind our brigade marker here, as we can see here, this is the brigade of General Peter Muhlenberg under General Nathaniel Greene's division. And General Greene would have answered directly to the Commander-in-Chief, General Washington. And behind the marker, you can see a fully reconstructed and maintained redoubt. The only one of its kind here at Valley Forge. We'll take a closer look at that soon. Now then, we're coming up to tour stop number 2, but before we get there, it's important that we put one legend to rest. The one about the dreadful weather. Valley Forge was not in fact a place where soldiers struggled through deep snowdrifts or endured awful winter storms. The fact is that the winter of 1777 and 1778 was actually relatively mild. There was a little bit of snow, and there was some rain. A winter with truly horrible weather did indeed lay in the unknown future in Morristown, New Jersey, but that's the story of Morristown, not the story of Valley Forge. We are going to get to the cabins of the Muellenberg Brigade in just a little bit. If you look very closely, you can see them over my shoulder in the distance here. But before we do, we're checking out what is left of the American outer line of defenses. There's not a great deal left, but there are a few things. Most notably is you have a cannon right here in front of a snow-covered embankment here, which is called a redan. A redan is a U or a V-shaped earthwork that's basically meant to provide cover for an artillery piece, as we can see here. And this redan would be part of a long entrenchment system that started right about here and extended past where we are standing, through that redoubt, out the other side, and far into the distance, creating a defensive line that would stretch about 2 miles. We are walking around the front of the ruined redoubt, and we can see that the outer defensive line would have gone on for quite a ways. There's really not much left of it. There aren't any real discernible trenches or trench lines. There's just a few remains here, such as the remains of this redoubt here. This is one of the redoubts on the defensive line. It's a good example of what happens when an army marches away and abandons the redoubt. It basically starts getting overgrown and falling apart. If we back down a little bit here, we can see the cannon over there. We have the redoubt right here. This would be the point of view of a hypothetical British attack trying to storm Valley Forge and coming up this hill. We have quite a hill here. Now remember, in your mind's eye, you have to take away pretty much everything you see here. You can see a lot of trees. They're all gone. If this were 1777, the trees are all gone because they're part of the log cabins now. The modern day houses, obviously, they're all gone. The Valley Forge Convention Center and hotel and casinos, they're all gone too. The modern highways, they're also all gone. The parking garages, all gone. And it would be nothing but a bare, empty slope, which would be very easy for the Americans to defend if the encampment ever actually came under attack. It never did, because the British didn't feel like it. We're going to be heading up to the cabins now. We've made it to tour stop number 2, the Peter Muhlenberg Brigade. We're going to be here for a while because there's an awful lot to unpack here at this stop. In fact, much of the story of the Valley Forge encampment can be learned here at the Mueller Brigade. There were 2 things that made Valley Forge ideal to George Washington when he chose it as a site for the winter encampment. Washington was determined to keep both his army and the rest of the country secure from British raiding parties during the winter. Valley Forge was the perfect location with which to do this. It had 2 things going for it. One was the location. At 18 miles northwest of Philadelphia, Valley Forge was close enough to the British to keep an eye on them, but it was far enough away to prevent a surprise attack. The British Army, if the British Army sortied from Philadelphia, it would have to march almost an entire day towards Valley Forge in order to make an attack. The Americans would have plenty of early warning. The second thing that Valley Forge had going for it was its topography. It formed a natural triangle with a river to the north, a mountain to the west, and a wide open plain that gently sloped to the southwest. This made Valley Forge an ideal camp to defend. Now, in making it to tour stop 2, the Peter Muhlenberg Brigade, we've made it from the visitor center around a little bit down the Adeline Drive, and to tour stop number 2, the Muhlenberg Brigade. And you can see the little boxes there representing the huts. There they are. And down the Adeline slope, here's the Adeline Drive with a few earthworks. And here they are. And here's our slope. The winter encampment, December 19th, 1777 to June 19th, 1778. The countryside was stripped of trees. All available wood went to build and heat the city of huts that crowded this ridge. When the Continental Army wintered here, every acre was heavily used for entrenchments, stock pens, an artillery park, and parade grounds. Fields turned to mud. Within decades after the war, this scene had returned to woodlots and farmland. The tour route encircles the encampment, now marked by earthworks and monuments. A natural triangle of defense, as we discussed earlier. The Schuylkill River, Mount Joy, and the ridge with the outer line earthworks. This map was sketched by Brigadier General Louis Lebec Deporté, Chief Engineer of the Continental Army. Deporté was one of several French officers who volunteered to help the Patriot cause. We just started our tour, so we're right here. And our route's going to take us basically all the way around the triangle and back again. The outer line defenses. Extending into the distance, an almost continuous line of earthworks formed the outer line defenses. If the British attacked from the south, they would have had to climb this open slope while the Americans fired from high ground. Assaults never materialized. Again, you have to use your imagination, but only just a little bit. There we have another cannon manning another defensive work, and you have to imagine earthworks and entrenchments extending all the way down the ridge, as far as the eye can see. Like I said, 3 stops in a row, about 1.5 miles or 2 miles of tour is going to be along this road, along this ridge. Let's get a closer look at the cabins. So the Muhlenberg Brigade. an essential position on the front line. You are standing on the front line of the Continental Army's Valley Forge encampment. General Peter Muhlenberg's Virginia Brigade, one of 15 brigades at Valley Forge, held this ground. His troops protected this position by building and then guarding a system of closely spaced huts, defensive entrenchments, and redoubts, such as the earthen fortifications up the path in front of you. These defensive works were called the outer line of defense. The defenses seemed so strong to the British that they never attacked. But the Continental soldiers must have wondered each night as they wearily crawled into their bunks if the next day might bring in an attack and if their defenses would hold. Here we got a bit of a map here showing the positions of all the brigades. The blue triangles with the names next to them, those are the 15 brigades that made up the Continental Army here at Valley Forge. We're here at the first one, Muellenberg. General Whedon's brigade is right next door, and then Patterson, and so on and so on. You got General Peter Muhlenberg. General Peter Muhlenberg, the fighting parson. Peter Muhlenberg grew up nearby in a prominent Pennsylvania German family. After schooling and brief military service in Germany, he moved to Virginia's frontier to serve as a minister to a community of German Americans. As war threatened, George Washington asked him to recruit and command a regiment. A natural leader, Muhlenberg enlisted 300 men in a day. Because most military units were raised from within a community, their troops shared experiences, outlooks, and even language. Although service in the Continental Army took these Virginians far from home, they shared a common heritage that might have eased the strain of 8 years of war. Like many Revolutionary War officers, Muhlenberg later joined the young American experiment in democracy, serving in the first United States Congress and later as a senator from Pennsylvania. Here we have a map here giving us the backstory of of what happened before Valley Forge. The road to Valley Forge. During the American Revolution, General George Washington and the Continental Army encamped here at Valley Forge for 6 months in the winter of 1777 to 1778. This was the third year of what would be an 8-year war. The British had landed at the head of the Chesapeake Bay in summer of 1777 and marched north with the intent of capturing Philadelphia, the Patriot capital. Although the Continental Army tried valiantly to save the city, their defeats at Brandywine and Germantown sealed Philadelphia's fate. In those days, armies ceased major operations during the winter because of the difficulty of moving on poor roads and of finding food for themselves and forage for the horses and the draft animals. With the British occupying Philadelphia, General Washington needed a safe place for the army to rest, retrain, and prepare for the war to heat up again. He chose Valley Forge. Just 20 miles away from Philadelphia, Valley Forge was close enough to spy on British activities, but far enough away to prevent a surprise attack. Washington used this hilly terrain to his advantage, building defensive lines on the ridges overlooking the approaches from the city and nestling the camp against the Schuylkill River to prevent attack from the north. From here, he could also protect lands to the north and west, where Congress and thousands of Patriot refugees had fled. Valley Forge had abundant fresh water, trees for shelter and firewood, and limited food and forage from the farms. Now, normally, these huts of the Muellenberg Brigade, inside these huts are exhibits, more exhibits, giving us useful information about the Continental Army, the makeup of the Army, what life was like for the average Continental soldier, what life was like for the officers, what medical care was like, what the neighborhood of Valley Forge was like. Such displays are in these huts, but unfortunately they're all locked up and closed because of COVID-19. Remember, this is being filmed in February of 2021. Got another exhibit table here. And that illustration that we can't get enough of. Remember, it's important to remember that the encampment didn't look anywhere near this beautiful. It got ugly and muddy real quickly. A city of huts, refuge for the winter. Welcome to the 4th largest city in America. Arriving in this rural area in the winter of 1777, soldiers immediately began building 2,000 log huts for shelter, earthworks for defense, and rubble roads to keep out of the deep boot-pulling mud. General Washington issued orders on the sizes and locations of the huts. Soldiers cleared all the trees from the countryside for miles around, dragging back the lumber to build log walls, shingle roofs, and rough bunks and stools. Most of this mighty task was finished within a month, despite shortages of tools. For 6 months, the log city's population rivaled Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. General Washington keeps his station at Valley Forge. I was there when the Army first began to build huts. They appeared to me like a family of beavers, everyone busy, some carrying logs, others mud, and the rest plastering them together. The whole was raised in a few days, and is a curious collection of buildings in true rustic order. And that was Thomas Paine to Benjamin Franklin in May of 1778. We have a sketch plan for what an encampment is supposed to look like. As Stoughton described in his regulations, in each brigade location, typically the smallest huts housed the soldiers and were located on the front line. As one's rank increased, so did the size of the hut. The commissary kitchen was placed at the rear, furthest from the enlisted men. Now, it's important to notice something right away, and this is going to be a theme. It's going to show up every time we see huts along this park. There are huts scattered all around the Valley Forge Park, but here at the Muellenberg Brigade, here's where we find the most of them grouped together. And they form this street, almost like a small city. Now note how the doors of the huts, the front of the hut, is facing the street, and so are the fronts of the huts on the other side of the street. The doors are facing each other. We will notice this several times during the tour of the encampment. And that is going to be one of the important defining characteristics, and ultimately one of the very bad problems of the Valley Forge encampment. We'll get on to why that is later on. But first, we're going to take a look at our reconstructed redoubt. So let's go see. Okay, we're coming up to the redoubt here. This is a reconstructed redoubt that the National Park Service has given us to better appreciate what the defensive fortifications would have looked at like. The original fortifications are, for the most part, long gone, and what's left of them really isn't all that much to look at. Because that's what happens when you have a pile of dirt and sticks and logs and neglect it for about 250 years. A redoubt is a fort. It's a small fort, basically made of earth, and it's used to anchor a trench line. They're usually, you take this redoubt and imagine in your mind's eye a trench line extending down towards the next redoubt, and more trenches and more redoubts, and so on and so forth. Then that would comprise the outer defensive line. The redoubt would be the hardest point in the trench line to attack, because it's protected on pretty much all sides. There is a key difference between a redoubt and a fort. A fort is usually built to last. They're made of brick or stone, and they usually defend an objective that's not going anywhere, such as like a city or a harbor. Redoubts are designed to be more temporary. They're temporary fortifications, and they're only really of any use whenever an army is in town. Once the Continental Army left Valley Forge, nobody cared about any of the redoubts anymore. They had served their purpose, and now they just went back to the soil. They just pretty much decayed, which is why they're not much to look at. They were never maintained afterwards. And that's why the National Park Service gave us this properly maintained and very impressive looking redoubt. The Advanced Redoubt, the Earthworks defense system. Soldiers constructed earthen fortifications called redoubts, which is French for a place of retreat. These redoubts were connected by miles of entrenchments designed to strengthen the natural advantages of the terrain here. These fortifications were part of the carefully planned system of defense at Valley Forge. This redoubt was one of 5. It was located so that they could overlook the approach from Philadelphia, which was occupied by the British, and also protect the far eastern end of the outer line of defense from attack. So if we were soldiers stationed in this redoubt, this is what our tactical situation would be like. We would be right here. We would be right here at redoubt number 5. Our back would be pretty much to the Schuylkill River. There isn't very much a place to retreat to, but also means that no one's coming to sneak up behind us. And we would have your earthworks extending for about 2 miles. We'd have other redoubts to fall back to in case ours got overrun. And coordinating everything would be George Washington at his headquarters. Another exhibit here. Redoubts were protection from attack. Building the redoubt. Troops originally built this redoubt by hand, using shovels and picks. A redoubt was cleverly designed so that every part strengthened its defensive role or provided an obstacle to attack. Soldiers appreciated how these pieces fit together and carefully built the redoubt to be strong because the safety of the camp depended on it. If the British attacked, would you feel confident in your safety here? And we have our Continental lads building the redoubt. I'm pretty sure this is the same drawing of the guys that we just saw a few minutes ago. And here we have a cross section of the redoubt. And this is actually pretty interesting. The walls, if we could see inside these walls, it wouldn't just be a heap or a mound of dirt. The walls would be actually built of rocks wrapped up in baskets full of rocks, baskets called gabions. A basket made from intertwined branches and filled with dirt and rocks to strengthen the interior redoubt wall. You'd position them and then you'd pile dirt on top of it, so the wall would be extra strong. The rear platform, that's the banquette on which the soldiers stood. The parapet would be the wall. Just in front of that you have the scarp, which is the near side of the ditch, and the ditch is fairly self-explanatory, also pretty obvious what it's doing there. You want the enemy to have to get as low as possible in order to scale up the wall. The glacis in this one, in this fort, it's not very easy to see, and the abatis are the sharpened stakes, which are probably the first things you notice about the outside of this particular fort. And you have 2 podiums here, which I believe are supposed to hold something. That's not there. On the lookout. The 5 redoubts were positioned on high points, each visible to each other. Officers used telescopes to observe and communicate visually. The frame is aimed towards redoubt number 3 on Mount Joy. Redoubt 3 anchored the southwest end of the inner defensive line. Overlooking one of the encampment roads, it defended the southern approaches to Valley Forge. Alright, so that's a hint as to what these frames would be focusing on if they were there. They're not, but that's not a problem. You can just zoom in on Mount Joy right there. Once again, I'm going to say this many times, you have to imagine that all of the trees are all gone. So there wouldn't be those trees in the mid-ground right there. They're all gone. And then Mount Joy in the background, that would be treeless too. So we would have a clear view at soldiers manning the redoubt. Right now we can't even see the redoubt because of all the trees. But that's not the way it would have been at Valley Forge. And this would be another lookout point. Once again, you can see the modern buildings of modern Valley Forge there. You have the hotel, the convention center, the casinos, the parking garages. Obviously, they would not be here. Are the British coming? A commanding view. Yes, it is. Look down this hill. Imagine you are a soldier on the lookout for British soldiers approaching from Philadelphia. In 1777, this view was completely open, with no trees, no buildings. The miles-long view from this hill top made this a well-protected defense location for the Continental Army. Take a look through the frame to appreciate the soldier's view over the road from Philadelphia, which lies about 20 miles southeast. This long view would have provided a critical early warning of the advancing enemy. General William Howe's British forces were cautious about the strength of the American position here, however. They never made the one-day march to attack Valley Forge. So if the British decided to attack, first of all, it's a day's march from Philadelphia, and then because of the views like this, the American lookouts would know the British were here before the British did. That'll pretty much wrap it up for our readout here. There's just one or two more things to investigate at the Muellenberg Brigade. The snow's covering it a little bit, but what we got here is basically that's a hill with a door in it, and that would be the bomb proof. This would be, as you can see, there are cannons deployed in this redoubt. And this is where you would find the extra ammunition for the cannons, because if the redoubt ever did come under direct attack, you had to watch out for enemy artillery places landing among your pile of munitions. So you had to keep the munitions safe. Otherwise, one enemy shot could blow up the entire redoubt, and that'd be bad. What we're coming up to now is a reconstruction of a camp kitchen. And you can see a brick oven. Relatively simple to build, but it was very, very important for the soldiers cooking up their meals. There'd be so many of these attached to every camp. That'd be the fancier way. Mother Nature is not cooperating with us because given the snow, she doesn't want us to see that there's also a fire ring, a very simple campfire ring buried here beneath the snow. That would be the more simpler way of cooking your food. Just light a fire and roast your meat on top of it. Again, this is a reconstruction. A note about the cabins here at Valley Forge. There are no original cabins here at Valley Forge. As soon as the Continental Army left, they were all torn down by local farmers who needed to use the wood. All of these cabins are reconstructions, and so is this kitchen. And here we have an exhibit table that gives us a little bit of early information on a topic that we're going to investigate later on, more in detail. Von Scheubens' transformation of the American Army. The large protected valley in front of you is the Grand Parade. Extending from where you are standing to the ridge almost a mile away, it served as the centerpiece of the camp. When units from the various states arrived at Valley Forge in December of 1777, their officers brought individual experiences and ideas about military operations and maneuvers. These differing tactics had limited the Army's effectiveness during battle. On the Grand Parade, soldiers from all the states spent months of daily training learning to act as a unified force. The winter was hard, the differences in experience were vast, and the outcome of the revolution was uncertain. But the result of the soldiers' training on the Grand Parade was that a stronger, more disciplined, and professional national army emerged, with new confidence and a stronger identity as an American army. And here we have a fairly famous painting by Edwin Austin Abbey. Prussian General Friedrich Wilhelm de Steuben brought European discipline to the Continental Army. From dawn till dusk, his voice was heard above the sounds of marching men as he shouted commands. In simulated battles, he trained them for the eventual campaign that they would wage against the British Army. The result, the demonstration and celebration on May 6, 1778. Now imagine that it's May 6, 1778. Arrayed on the Grand Parade in front of you are 10,000 Continental soldiers. They're demonstrating their new skills for General Washington and a crowd of dignitaries. This is the gala celebration of the new military alliance with France, which has just been announced. The soldiers move into position for inspection. They form battalions and maneuver around the Grand Parade as if on the field of battle. At a signal, 13 cannon discharge at once. Like a wave, running musket fire circles around the Grand Parade. After passing in review, it's extra rations for everyone. Huzzah! This will about wrap it up for tour stop number 2, the Muhlenberg Brigade. And our next stop will be the approaches for stop number 3, the National Memorial Arch. All right, we're leaving tour stop number 2. We're making our way to tour stop number 3, which is all the way in the distance there, the Memorial Arch. We're passing our 3rd brigade marker now. But before we get to stop number 3, we come to this marker. Okay, you can see tour stop number 3 in the distance. It's hard to make out, but in the center there, that's the Memorial Arch with one of the little cabins in front of it. But before we get there, we need to take a minute and appreciate this monument here. This is the first of many monuments that we're going to see on our tour that is dedicated to a state. What we have here is the Maine Monument, put up by the state of Maine to honor all of the soldiers that came from what we now call the state of Maine. It's probably one of the most unusual such monuments on the park because, of course, there was no state of Maine at the time of the American Revolution. What we now call Maine was part of Massachusetts. Massachusetts was a state that was in 2 areas. So we come up to this, it says, to commemorate the officers and men from that part of New England, now known as the state of Maine, who served in Massachusetts regiments in this Continental Army under Washington at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 1778, sharing the hardships there endured, this memorial is erected by the state of Maine under the auspices of the Maine Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. And this monument dates back to 1907. This is the first state marker that we meet on our tour. It's right between stops 2 and 3. And there's going to be several more